I want to thank you for joining me. Grateful to have you here today on another Mindful Monday. My name is Bob Cunningham, and I'm an employee assistance counselor with Life and Work Connections. I've been a counselor for about 17 years, and I've been with Life and Work Connections coming up on 2 years in July. And one of the topics that I've developed a keen interest in is on burnout prevention. And if you had an opportunity to attend one of our in-person seminars, we do an in-person seminar called Rejuvenate that we put on last year. And we were actually just getting ready to prepare Rejuvenate for the next year when COVID-19 happened. So hopefully we'll be able to get back to that. And I just want to put a message out to those of you that may not have had a chance to go to one of those, that hopefully that'll be something that we'll be doing again in the near future. But again, burnout was one topic that I presented on at Rejuvenate last year. And the reason I got interested in burnout was I noticed that a lot of my clients were showing up for individual sessions with exhibiting signs and symptoms of burnout. Now, you might imagine that, you might be wondering, well, why is he talking about burnout? This presentation is about perfectionism. Well, you might imagine that perfectionism and burnout kind of go hand in hand. And especially in this environment that we work in a sort of, an academic environment, a high achieving environment, it's sort of a breeding ground for perfectionism, and it attracts people who are high achievers and may have that sort of perfectionistic personality. And so I thought for this presentation on 15 for You, that this might be a good topic for us to explore a little bit together. And then I'd like to also provide you with some suggested interventions that I hope will also be helpful to you. Now, I think on some level, we can all relate to perfectionism, whether it's putting together the perfect meal for a group of friends or family, or perhaps you have the disapproving mother-in-law coming over for dinner sometime, and you want to make sure that everything is just right. You want the food to be cooked just right. You want the wine to be just right. And so it sort of triggers this perfectionism within us. Or maybe if you don't relate to that example, maybe you've been tasked with a project at work or some sort of presentation where your coworkers are going to be observing the work that you've done, and you want to make sure that the work that you do is valued and accepted by your coworkers, as opposed to being disapproved of. Now you might be sitting there thinking, perfectionism, it's not really a problem for me. I get a little bit of stressed about things sometimes in my life, but I pretty much roll with the punches, and perfectionism, I don't really struggle with that topic. And if that's the case, what I would say is whatever you're doing, first off, I'd say that's great, keep doing what you're doing. But I'd also ask you to reflect on what is it that you're doing well that's working for you, and keep doing those things. That's often something that I do with clients in individual therapy is what's working well for you in your life. And there's this whole idea of continue to keep doing what's working and do more of it. But for the rest of us, some of us really struggle with perfectionism, almost to the point where perfectionism can be really a painful thing to live with, almost as if in this picture, the walls are sort of closing in on us. It can feel kind of suffocating, like there's no escape. We feel like we always have to be perfect. And so we're sort of like a hamster on the hamster wheel in that way. And then for some of us, perfectionism isn't always ever present, but is sort of like a flame that burns within us, kind of like a pilot light on a water heater or a pilot light on your stove. It's not always on full blast, but when the right circumstance comes along, it can sort of ignite that tendency, that need to feel like I have to be perfect. And then that tendency towards perfectionism can kind of engulf us, can sort of take us over. So if we look at this idea of perfectionism, it's not really about being perfect, is it? Perfectionism isn't about being perfect. It's really about avoiding painful feelings. It's about avoiding feelings of fear, feelings of anxiety. And in a way it works because we teach ourselves, well, if I do everything perfectly and everything goes well, and then we have that experience, then we reinforce for ourselves that, see, doing things perfectly works. But in the long run, and what I've learned from my clients is this starts to take a toll on people. It starts to burn people out. So the challenge is in figuring out how can I still be a high achiever, but learn to dial things back in a way that I can take better care of myself and not feel like I'm always running on high octane. And then the other piece of this, part of what drives this perfectionism is our desire to be liked, our desire to be accepted by our coworkers, to be liked by our family and friends, and to be loved. In fact, there was a family therapist a number of years ago by the name of Virginia Satir. And you've heard this analogy before. It's just the tip of the iceberg. Well, she had a model that she used to use called the iceberg method. And she would often say that behavior, she was a family therapist, and she would say that behavior in the family is just the tip of the iceberg. There's always a lot more going on underneath the surface of the water. So when it comes to perfectionistic behavior, part of what we want to look at is, well, what are the thoughts that come up for me around this? Thoughts like, oh, it could be what if it's a total failure? Thinking like expecting a catastrophe to happen, the worst possible things to happen, which of course creates feelings of fear and anxiety. Perceptions that our coworkers might think less of us if we don't do the perfect presentation, or if we don't put on the perfect dinner party. And these expectations that might happen. But at the root of it, what we're really driving for is we have this yearning, and this is according to Satir's method, that we have this yearning to be loved, to be accepted, to be truly connected to other people. And so what happens is perfectionistic behavior kind of holds us hostage. We're literally handcuffed by perfectionism, this feeling that we need to be perfect all the time. And so before we get into the exercise for today, I wanted to get you thinking about, well, is this something that really applies to me? And so I thought I'd do a page on, you might be a perfectionist if you're a procrastinator. So people that procrastinate, they have so much fear and worry about being perfect that they have difficulty getting going altogether. And if they don't get anything done, then they don't have to worry about failing because they didn't get it done anyway. So the key antidote for procrastination is to just start. Even though it may not be what you want it to be, just start putting something down on pen and paper. You may be one of these folks that's an all or nothing thinker. Let's say you put on the dinner party and everything goes perfectly as you would expect it to, right? But then your mother-in-law, the disapproving and mother-in-law says, you know, that wine tasted a little bit bitter. And so instead of looking at it like, well, you know, the dinner party went really well, except this, you know, mother-in-law didn't like the wine, the perfectionist will tend to go to, oh my God, this is a total failure. My mother-in-law hated it. She hated everything, when in fact, all she said was that the wine was a little bit bitter. So it's sort of this all or nothing thing that is a trap that perfectionists can fall into. And then of course you have the unforgiving critic, what I like to call the nasty little voice that's there sort of sitting on your shoulder, reminding you that no matter what you do, it's never going to be good enough. And so part of when I work with a person, part of what I try to help them to instill is this mantra that start practicing reminding yourself that, you know what, who I am is good enough. The work that I do is good enough, as opposed to having this inner critic that's always in the driver's seat and ending up leaving you sort of feeling persistently dissatisfied with life. Acknowledge yourself for those small accomplishments. So now I'd like to invite you to do a short practice with me. This practice is called holding space. And what I'd like you to do before we actually get into the practice, I would like you to imagine that out in front of you is this sort of bubble. And in this bubble, it can have whatever shape you want. But I want you to think of a project or something that's coming up in your life and that it's floating inside of this bubble. And it's just there suspended in front of you. We're holding it in that space, okay? So imagine that there, just leave that there floating for a moment. What I'd like you to do, let's start with 3 deep breaths. And as we're breathing in, we're settling in, we're bringing our awareness into our body. And we're noticing any feelings that might be there that we might be present to. where those feelings might be showing up in our body. And now I want you to imagine that that bubble is floating a little bit closer to you. And if you're having trouble thinking of something, that's okay. I'd like you to just kind of pretend or act as if you've got this project or this thing coming up that you have to work on. Do the best that you can. And imagine that it's coming closer to you. And what sort of feelings this brings up for you? Does it feel any different? Maybe a little bit of a spike of anxiety about an upcoming presentation or an upcoming project. And know that one of the things that you always have available to you, and I've talked about this in previous presentations, is the power of the breath. That regardless of what feeling that brings up for you, that you can always breathe into it. You can always breathe into that awareness. And so part of our task with this exercise is bringing awareness to the feelings that come up for us around these projects, around these things that tend to spike our anxiety. The other task is to start to build emotional tolerance. We want to teach ourselves that, you know what, I do have some anxiety around this, but I can learn to tolerate those feelings when I think about those things that I have to do. And so know that this is a brief mindfulness exercise that you can do anywhere in a matter of a few minutes to bring some awareness to what comes up for me around this exercise. What are the feelings that are present to me when I'm doing this exercise? Is it fear? Is it anxiety? Do I have some sort of persistent worry that comes up? And now I know that when I take the time to do this, I can learn to tolerate those feelings when they come up. And I can use the power of the breath to help myself calm down or to help myself bring some calmer energy to that moment. Now, when it feels okay for you, go ahead and open your eyes. Now, I think a good follow-up to doing this exercise, I always like to encourage people to try journaling. Now, not everybody likes to write, and if that's not your thing, that's okay. I'd invite you to give it a try anyway, but I call it journaling for emotional health. And so a follow-up journaling exercise for this might be, well, you know, I just did this mindfulness practice of holding space for this project I have coming up at work. What came up for me around that? Is it that I'm really worried about what my coworkers might think of me? Is it that I have concerns about what my family or friends might think about me if I don't do the perfect meal? And then how can I practice being imperfect? And practicing being imperfect it really does take some intention. We do have to intentionally practice being imperfect. And if I can share share an example with you of how I do this in my own life, one of the areas that brings up perfectionistic tendencies for me is in public speaking. So the way that I practice this in my own life is through Toastmasters. I joined Toastmasters. And so in Toastmasters, it's all about public speaking. You make a commitment to making a speech on a particular date. And whether I'm ready on that date, in my mind, ready to where I think I should be, I do my speech. And so I practice being imperfect. It's going to be however it's going to be that day. And so one way that you can do this in your own life is through this thing called the 8 out of 10 approach, or what I call it the base hit approach for those of you that are baseball fans. And so an example of this is if there's something that you think, you know what, I've got to have a home run on this particular project. It's got to be a 10 out of a 10. A way that you can maybe practice cutting yourself some slack is, do I really need a home run? Maybe it's okay if I get an 8 out of 10 out of today, whatever it is that I need to do today. Maybe it's okay if I just get a base hit or a double. For those of you that like baseball, base hit, double, triple. I don't have to necessarily hit a home run. So my invitation to you is give this practice a try, the holding space, and invite yourself to be imperfect. Invite yourself to see if you can do that. See if you can engage in something where, you know what, I don't have to always do things perfectly, because you are a person of value. You don't always have to do things perfectly. And my hope is that you take something from this presentation today and that you have an opportunity to practice being imperfect. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. I thank you for joining me today. And next week is a holiday, so we won't have a Mindful Monday. Thanks again for joining me. Take care.